Are you ready?
Oh, did now mean like now he's president?
Hey guys.
Oh, hey!
You just kind of walked up on us.
So funny.
We didn't even know
At the
you
same
were
time,
here.
every day for 3 weeks.
Wow. Well, hey, welcome back to the One Room Schoolhouse.
We're Tim.
And that's, I don't even know what to do. No, I'm Tim.
He's Tim, and I'm John.
I am Spartacus. I don't even know what's happening right now.
Oh, that's a good callback.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We'll keep moving. So we've been looking this week at World War II. We started with kind of the reason we got into World War II is most Americans don't get a lot of details when it comes to World War II, the history, the heroes. We want to spend a little time going through some of that, telling some of the stories. So we talked about a little bit. I think on Tuesday was the way that God got a hold of some people's lives in really cool ways. People who very hard, very rough, weren't religious people, but man, what the gospel did change in their life. Yesterday, we talked about the European theater. We went through some details. Obviously, there's so much more. Yeah. Just barely scratched the surface.
We reduced 4 years to 15, 20 minutes, so there's a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, really, we only mentioned really two people, too. We kind of mentioned Dwight Eisenhower. We mentioned Patton just a little bit. I guess General James O'Neill. But there's so many people we could have gotten into and talked about. Today, we're going to condense as well, looking at the Pacific Theater, because we pointed out yesterday, so this was the proclamation from Harry Truman. You see down here the signature at the bottom, Harry Truman. This was the end of the European theater. So after the European theater ends, attention now is really focused on Japan. Yeah. But even
a lot of that reason was because the official kind of Allied policy, which goes back even to America's first involvement in the war, is that we're taking a Germany first perspective, and it was Roosevelt's chief of the army staff, George Marshall. He outlines this in a plan.
And by the way, that name Marshall may sound familiar. The Marshall Plan, how they rebuilt Europe afterwards.
Yep.
George C. Marshall becomes a 5-star general. Very few of those, only in battle do you have that. So Marshall, his chief.
Really significant influence on the course of the war, but they identify that we need to take a Germany first approach to this. So really for a lot of it, the guys in the Pacific like Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz are kind of on their own, at least certainly to start out with. And in fact, right, the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese go island to island and just decimate the Allied forces.
You said that. Back up for just a second, because we talked about Pearl Harbor started all this for America. This is where we got in.
Yep.
So that's the 7th of December of 1941. On the 8th of December 1941, hardly ever appears in the history books, the Japanese hit the Philippines. Now, when they hit Hawaii, that was American territory at the time. It wasn't a state. When they hit the Philippines, that was an American territory at the time. And a guy named MacArthur, who was a young general, retired out there. He lived there. He had his own home.
I mean, living the dream, right? I'll serve my country.
Gone.
I retired to a Pacific island. I mean,
and so when the Japanese,
relaxing.
on the 8th of December, when they hit it, they wiped out every American plane in the Pacific. We had nothing out there. So let's focus on Germany, because we've got literally nothing out there. And so it was more decimating, probably percentage-wise, on the Philippines than it was even on Hawaii. But that's why attention's not there.
Part of the Marshall Plan, too, was if we can defeat Germany, Japan doesn't have any friends left. They're going to basically just give up and surrender, was part of the idea.
Yeah. Literally in the text, they say that, if we beat Germany, the likelihood is Japan will just surrender without a shot having to be fired or any loss of life, which just goes to show how wildly misunderstood the Japanese mentality was at that early period by some of the top brass, right? Because Japan, right, they had signed the Tripartite Act, right, which joined them with Italy and Germany, right, the Axis powers. So they assumed if we beat Italy and we beat Germany, Japan will obviously surrender because they'll know that their situation is hopeless. But obviously found out that wasn't the case.
So with attention being centered on Europe at the time, after that conflict is over, and actually really during that conflict, Japan is doing a lot of conquering in the meantime. Japan is going all around from different islands and really almost unopposed in some regards.
Absolutely.
With what they're able to conquer. And this is where when the Philippines are conquered and MacArthur is called back, there's a famous speech as he's leaving that I will return. And he does end up returning eventually, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
In the middle of the European theater, even though there wasn't a lot of attention given to the Pacific theater, there was some attention because during kind of one of the heights of the European theater, MacArthur does return to the Philippines.
Yeah.
We actually have a pretty cool thing from him.
Because what happened was Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to get out of the Philippines. MacArthur didn't want to leave. That was now his home. He's going to defend it. He said, no, you go to Australia. You leave. And so when he left, he said, Philippine people, because he considered himself a Filipino. I mean, that's what he thought of himself.
Well, that was his nation. It's where he lived.
That's his nation. And so it's like, being a Texan. That was a territory. That's where he lived. And
I don't know if it's exactly like that.
It's coming back. And so he gives this famous speech, says, I will return. Well, now that things start shifting and really, we looked yesterday at D-Day. Once you came ashore on D-Day, things started turning for the Germans. And then you have the Battle of the Bulge, and they lose that. Right at that time, between D-Day and Battle of the Bulge, is when MacArthur is now able to come back, because we are turning out planes at a high rate. We are turning out ships at a high rate. We're able to put more tension over on the really Pacific theater. And so this is his actual I have returned order.
Which is just, incredible. You can find it online, read it in its entirety. It ends in a really fun way, which I will read right now. And it says, the guidance of divine God points the way. Follow in his name to the holy grail of righteous victory. So, MacArthur carrying on with this attitude of, we are fighting to free those who are oppressed, fighting in a righteous cause, to restore liberty to these people who have just been completely decimated, wiped out, brutalized by this occupation by a clearly enemy force. So MacArthur returns, and really this is kind of a part of the wider campaign in the Pacific that's known today as this island hopping
And by the
idea.
way, to put a perspective on MacArthur, just as you had Eisenhower, who was over everything in the Eastern Theater, MacArthur's over everything in the Pacific Theater. So everything that's going in the Pacific, MacArthur is the guy on top of it. And this island hopping campaign was, all right, now let's move from Pearl Harbor. Now start taking one island at a time going out. And MacArthur said, that's crazy. He said the Japanese know which island we're coming to next. So
if we were to do it in order, they'd be prepared for us. That doesn't make any sense at all military strategically. No, we need to be a little more strategic and not tell them exactly the island we're trying to take.
So he had what he called island cartwheeling. He would do cartwheels and skip some islands, and he popped around, and it was brutal every single time we fought the Japanese. The casualties are so high. I was reading on Guadalcanal, which is one of the early battles after we start turning that direction. A number of Medal of Honor winners out of Guadalcanal, but it's stuff that's hard for us to imagine, but there were like 200,000 Japanese on Guadalcanal when the battle started. And at the end of it, there were like only 10,000 left. It was unbelievable. Japanese families had hand grenades, and if the Americans won, they blow up their family, and it's like, it was new for Americans.
Yeah,
We're
so
just not used to thinking like
one
that.
of the things that certainly looking back historically, military Shintoism was part of the Japanese culture at the time. And part of military Shintoism acknowledged that it would be honorable to die for your ancestors, to die for the emperor, to die for your country. And if you did something that was dishonorable, actually taking your own life was the honorable thing to do at that point. And honor was a big deal in culture. It's just they defined honor a lot different than we would define honor. And certainly their notion of the value of life would be a different perspective than maybe our notion of the value of life. And that's one of the reasons as some of this campaign went along with taking island, we eventually took an island and we realized now we're going to have to get to the main island at some point, and we don't want to have to do the same level of invasion.
Let me do a quick one right here. This is a letter from a guy named Ira Hayes. You can see his name at the bottom there, Ira Hayes. And Ira Hayes is a Pima Indian. And when we got to the Battle of Iwo Jima, which is one of the well-known battles, you have the raising of the American flag there at Iwo Jima, and you have 6 guys lifting the flag into the wind, and those those 6 guys, that is now the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. The 6 guys raising that flag. The last guy in that photograph, that famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal, the last guy with his hand up, the flag pole has just gone out of his hand. That's Ira Hayes. He's the Pima Indian. And that letter from Ira is one that he wrote to his family from Iwo Jima. Talks about his prayer habits, really what it did to change his life, and praying and talking to other guys about prayer. But it also is one of the sad things of the war. He came back with PTSD as a result of what he saw. Because Iwo Jima, there were like 25,000 American casualties. And he said, I don't know why these guys died and I lived. I should have died, not them. They were good guys. And so when he came back after the war, he actually, in a period of 10 years, was arrested, I think, 52 or 53 times with public drunkenness, and actually ended up dying at a very young age. But that was PTSD before we really knew what it was. But what he saw in that island kind of stuff in the Pacific was just...
Yeah, what the military soldiers, the American soldiers had to do was obviously a relatively daunting task up against a military that was not afraid to die, and actually seemingly really enjoyed taking other life, which we'll get to that in a second. But as they are taking some of these islands, and there are some great old movies about that as well. John Wayne has some great movies from the Pacific Theater.
Iwo Jima, the fighting CVs, flying like this.
So we're John Wayne fans also, by the way. So if you don't notice, we're going to reference his movies periodically as we talk about some of this period. But eventually, we take an island that has a radio tower, and it allows us to communicate with the main island, and we start warning the Japanese, hey, we don't want any more loss of life. We don't want to lose any of our people. We don't want any of you to die. We want you guys to surrender. Encourage the emperor, encourage your leaders, tell them to surrender. And this went on every 15 minutes. We were doing a radio broadcast for the people of Japan to hear and know that we don't want anybody to die, but we're not gonna finish until they surrender.
Yeah, it was a radio known as KSAI. It was on the island of Saipan. In Saipan, we had taken so many islands. The Japanese did not win a single battle once we started moving to the west. And so we're now within range from Saipan. We can launch our bombers and we can go pound the dickens out of Japan. We can kill whoever we want and bring them back. And so that's what changed the war. We're now within range. We can bomb you guys. I mean, we did. We sent bombers, B-29 bombers, into Tokyo. Our B-29, they would not surrender. Our B-29 bombers on bombing rate killed 100,000 people just in Tokyo. And so saying, guys, we're here. We can destroy you. We can take you out. We don't want to. Please don't make us do this.
Yeah, one of the military strategies that was implemented because we did not want to take more lives than we needed to. You actually can get online and you can find a lot about these little pamphlets, these leaflets that were dropped. The U.S. government identifies there were more than 70 million leaflets that were dropped in Japan. And what's interesting is when you look at the leaflets, and there's all different kinds, but on the back it would have writing. And the writing would warn them about what was coming. And this one's actually been translated, so you can read the full context below. But on this one, it tells the very specific cities, and there were 32 cities.
Well, this is the one that kind of got it started. This one here looks like Japanese money. And so we would drop hundreds of thousands of these out of plane over to Japan. We could be bombing them because our planes are there, but we're dropping these. And on the back, it gives 35 cities. It says, Japanese people, here are the 35 cities we're going to bomb because these cities have military factories, military production. We want to tell you, these 35 cities, we want you gone from there. We're going to bomb them because of the military, but please don't be there. We don't want to kill any civilians at all. Please get out of town.
What was identified, even on this one, is we're looking for military facilities, military installations, and we don't want you near them. We bomb them. Please get away. It became a capital offense in Japan to pick these up off the ground because they encouraged the Japanese to surrender, and a military Shintoism that's totally unacceptable. We don't want to surrender. And part of the reason that we started dropping leaflets and we wanted to surrender was because reports came back that if we had to do a land invasion like was done over in Europe, this was going to be a major loss of life. The estimates were that it could be up to 4 million Allied soldiers that would die in a land invasion, and 1 million of those would be Americans, is what the estimates were. Yeah. And it could be between 5 and 10 million Japanese that it was going to take that many deaths, that much loss of life before they finally surrendered. And so Harry Truman gets word and says, hey, There's another option we have. There's a bomb. We just experimented like a week ago with it. We think it's going to work, this big atomic bomb. And so that's what they kind of end up going to. And actually,
this becomes important in that point because these are the B-29 bombers that have bombed Tokyo, taking 100,000 lives, and they're bombing all over Japan, all these 35 cities. And you can imagine, by the way, the American pilots were not happy with the Japanese now being told what cities we're coming to, because guess where the anti-aircraft guns are waiting? 35 cities. This particular one says, Japanese people, you have seen what a B-29 can do. This is famous. It's got 5 B-29s here. This one says, we have a single bomb that will do what 2,000 B-29s do. Don't make us use that bomb. And so this is part of telling, we've got a bomb we can use. We don't want to use it. Don't make us use this. Please, please, please surrender. You have not won a battle since Germany lost. Don't make us do this.
Now, this was also part of the strategy to avoid the land invasion, but we did end up dropping atomic bombs.
And what we have right here is actually a picture of some of the destruction that caused. But what's interesting about this is it has a note, and it's signed by the navigator, the Enola Gay, which was the plane that dropped the first
Dutch
atomic
Van Kirk
bomb.
right there.
Yeah, Dutch Van Kirk. And he is much older now. This is actually his writing right here explaining why he dropped the bomb. Because, right, this was a big task. And so he explains that most people do not recall why we dropped the atomic bombs. It was forgotten after 64 years, which kind of gives you an idea of how long afterwards he's writing this. Forgotten after 64 years, only remembering the large casualties they caused. We dropped the bombs to end the war and stop the killing by destroying military and military support facilities, defending against an invasion. Earlier, we dropped millions of leaflets, which were largely ignored. So this is the navigator talking about, why we did it, why we had to do it, and these leaflets that were dropped. And what's interesting, actually, we talked earlier. Oh yeah, this is another one also with Dutch Van Kirk. But we talked earlier this week about Fashida, right, and Deshazer and their amazing conversion to Christianity. Well, Fashida later actually meets Paul Tibbets, who's the pilot of the Enola Gay.
By the way, this is the bombing picture of it, and there's Paul Tibbets'
That's actually
son.
his signature right there, Paul Tibbets. So Fashida, right, the guy who led Pearl Harbor, meets the man who dropped the bomb on the on the Japanese. And Fashida actually tells him, you know what, y'all made the right call in this because we weren't going to surrender. There was going to be such a massive loss of life because, right, the culture in the Japanese military and a large part of the Japanese population at that time was, right, fight at all costs, never surrender,
and the casualty rate from the 2 bombs, because we dropped the first bomb on August 6th, the Japanese did not surrender. We dropped the second August 9th, they didn't surrender. Those 2 bombs immediately took out about 150,000 lives. Then the after effects of radiation, etc., it puts it up somewhere under 300,000 lives. So that's
but
a lot
another
of loss.
150,000, so less than 300,000 total is what
That's
you're saying.
right.
So radiation about doubled what the explosion did. Now, the reason that matters to recognize 300,000 lives, we talked to a military historian who identified that in Japan, the Japanese beheaded more people than both atomic bombs killed. So more than 300,000.
That's an Allied soldier. He was one of the soldiers.
That is a
killed.
prisoner of war. More than 300,000 people were beheaded by the Japanese. And so today people talk about, well, the atomic bombs were so bad. No, the atomic bombs were big, they were massive, and they were deadly. Those were really big, bad bombs. But we don't often hear the other side of the story of what the opposition was. We talked earlier this week about how more than 10 million Chinese had been killed by the Japanese. There's reports of what the Chinese did to the Koreans, and then certainly what they did to prisoners of war.
Because quite frankly, Japan at that time would have been the ISIS of that era. They went to South Korea, they took South Korean women to be sex slaves. They wanted a genocide of all the Chinese.
The barbarity of how they treated people is similar to the barbarity of how ISIS treats people today, which most people don't understand. And this is where it gets interesting, because after both atomic bombs are dropped, after they finally do surrender, there then is an effort made that we need to help change part of the culture. Now, interesting.
And actually what we have right here, this is a new artifact that we recently got in.
The surrender happened on the 14th of August. So.
Yeah, the unofficial surrender. We talked about that earlier, right? The treaties were signed later in September. But what we have here is a U.S. Naval Communication And what it is, it's classified, secret, but it's instructing their forces to cease all offensive operations against Japanese forces. And then it instructs them also to continue the searches and patrols, military defense, and at the highest level, and beware of treachery or last-moment attacks by enemy forces of individuals. Because at this point, the American generals had recognized, Japan is an enemy unlike anybody we faced before, and there have been numerous occasions of Japanese forces surrendering only to then launch a surprise attack. So at this point, the American forces are extremely wary of, even now, after 2 atomic bombs, they still don't think the fight's given up.
Well, after this happens to a country, how do you rebuild it? Which becomes the next thing, because now they have officially surrendered. They surrendered on the 14th, and now the treaty signed, and so now you got to go in and do something with this.
Yeah, and this is where MacArthur is one of the key players in this. We identified, right, he was in the Philippines, he saw the destruction, he told them, I'm going to come back, he came back, and he was a person of faith, and Japan had been barbaric in ways, even though in Europe, right, the Germans, we recognize what they did with the Holocaust camps, unbelievable, atrocious, awful. Not a lot of attention is paid to how barbaric the Japanese were in some situations as well. And so this was something people were looking at going, okay, this culture has got to change. Military Shintoism has got to change. So MacArthur is a guy helped task with helping try to change the culture. And he has some neat ideas how to do it.
Yeah, we talked Tuesday on the fact that MacArthur said, you want to change this culture? I need 5,000 missionaries now. Give me Christian missionaries. Got to get the Bible in here. The Bible did become a best-selling book in Japan in that time. So there was a lot of rebuilding that went on. And it's amazing to me that MacArthur, and he's the perfect guy for this because, again, he loved the Far East. He loved that area. He considered himself a Filipino. I mean, that was his home. And he understood the thinking. And in 7 years, he takes that country from being one of barbarism unlike anything. It was the Japanese Empire at that time. It was called that because they had conquered so many other Asian nations around them. I mean, the list of nations they conquered is huge. So he goes in, and in 7 years, he takes that mentality, he so changes it that at the end of 7 years, now women have rights, they have places, they have position, you have private property. It wasn't all the private property is owned just by a handful of people. You now have an elective form of government. You now have got rid of military Shinto. It is so big a dramatic change in 7 years that actually the world receives Japan back in among the United Nations as a welcome ally in only 7 years. The transformation he pulled off is just radical.
Yeah, and at the time, I think it was still called the League of Nations, right? It was at that time. So they're brought back into the League of Nations, and this is where it's interesting, too, because one of the accusations at times against America is, well, these Americans, they just were nation-building in these wars. And
right? It's the American empire, not the Japanese empire.
And this is, you look at Japan today, Japan is one of the most successful nations in the world today. They're one of the top economic producers in the world today. They're great in so many areas. Well, that was a nation that if America really was imperialistic, if we were into nation building, there wouldn't be a Japan, and Japan got there through America's help. I mean, really, Douglas MacArthur was a guy, and faith played a vital role for him, helping change military Shintoism, kind of that worldview philosophy back to a different Christian mentality, which allowed them to be, again, accepted to the League of Nations, the UN, right, kind of what it is today. But this is where it's interesting looking at some of that story. Again, we obviously abbreviated so much. There's so many more details into this.
Oh, and by the way, even behind you, Tim, over your shoulder, that is the handwritten account of the last bomb that was dropped in Japan. This is the bomb that was dropped, and minutes after they dropped this is when Japan actually surrendered. So, I mean, you're right, Tim. There is so much more we could go through, so many more stories, so many more heroes and just great people to talk about.
But I think MacArthur was a good guy to finish with he was, and he's a person of faith. You can do a lot of study in him, a lot of really cool things about his life. He was advisor to many significant people for a lot of years. People encouraged him to be a president one day, just like Eisenhower had done. But one of the cool things we have is in regards to him talking about being a father in contrast to being a soldier.
Yeah, so this is him. You can see his signature right here, but he explains what are his priorities, and he talks that by profession, I am a soldier and take pride in that fact. But I am prouder, infinitely prouder, to be a father. A soldier destroys in order to build. The father only builds, never destroys. One has the potentialities of death, the other embodies creation and life. And while the hordes of death are mighty, the battalions of life are mightier still. It is my hope that my son, when I am gone, will remember me not from the battle, but in the home, repeating with him our simple daily prayers, Our Father who art in heaven. Which is just an incredible statement, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much in there about, the guy who rebuilt Japan talking about how it's more important to be a father because that's only life.
And what a legacy he wants his son to remember, them praying together. That's not beyond every military success, victory, right, accolade.
He was actually a Medal of Honor winner as well. He was awarded the
to
Medal
say,
of
I
Honor.
want my son to remember our prayer time together. I mean, this is why we say, right, that there's so much more we get into, so many cool stories. Tomorrow we're going to cover one. Dwight Eisenhower, absolutely incredible story, great guy from World War II. So make plans tomorrow. You are going to want to see the Dwight Eisenhower stories. We get into it tomorrow. As always, if you guys have questions, you can put them in the comment box. We're praying for you guys, and we're believing this Corona thing's coming to an end really soon, but hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow.